Have you ever just wondered how Pablo Escobar became the wealthiest drug lord of all time? Like, who was he before cocaine? Did he have any jobs? Did he go to school? And most importantly, what was so special about his cocaine shipments? He definitely wasn't the only drug lord dealing in narcotics. Now, if these are questions you'd love answers to, stick around and let's find out. The year was 1949, and Colombia was in the middle of a war, the La Violencia War. If you're watching this right now and you were alive back then, you'd know just how crazy this time period in Colombia was. And it just so happens that that was the exact year Pablo Escobar was born. His dad, who was a peasant farmer, and his mom, who was a school teacher, knew they couldn't raise a child in the middle of all the happenings. So they decided to move to a suburban city in Medellin called Envigado when Pablo was just 2 years old. And just when Pablo's parents thought that they were making the right decision, they literally were throwing themselves out of the frying pan into the fire. You know why? Well, because Medellin was cold. And by that I mean people were dying like flies. In a city with approximately 2 million residents, about 4 people died per day. And no day went by without the clash between militants fighting for opposing political parties that started the war. This was one of the reasons why Escobar had such a huge appetite for violence. Because quite literally, he grew up in it. It wasn't until Escobar was 9 years old that the war ended, but the damage to his childhood had already been done. While in high school with his cousin Gustavo Gaviria, Pablo started engaging in some petty crimes, like forging high school diplomas and altering grades for students. But right before his 17th birthday, he dropped out of high school to polish himself into the hard gangster life on the streets of Medellin. And I really gotta say this, if all Pablo wanted was to be a gangster and make a couple $1,000s, then he would have been perfectly fine. However, he always had the mindset of being at the top. He didn't want to remain on the streets forever, so he enrolled into a Colombian college. And yeah, I just said he dropped out of high school. So now you're wondering, well, how did he get into college, right? Well, I also just said that he forged high school certificates, so that kind of explains it. He also had big dreams of becoming a politician, a criminal lawyer, and eventually, a president. But once you enter the streets, it's almost impossible to leave. And with Pablo already making a name for himself around Medellin as a notorious gangster, he ended up ditching college and going back to those dirty deeds. Once school was out of the way, Pablo had the opportunity to enhance his street portfolio. He decided to try his hands at different things, from selling fake lottery tickets to stealing automobiles. Pablo did it all. He had a little group of criminals that carried out his criminal deeds with him. He got deeper and deeper into the streets. But his first high-paying job was being a contract kidnapper. It's funny, right? The same man who was named one of the richest men on the planet once kidnapped people for a living. That's a humble beginning. But for Pablo back then, it was one very lucrative job. I'd like to tell you just how lucrative it was. He earned a whopping 50 grand for kidnapping and killing a famous businessman known as Diego Echevarria. But as much as that job was easily paying his bills and funding his lifestyle, rumors went around about a new business in Medellin. A business that was generating more than 10 times what other illegal businesses were generating at the time. That business, mi amigos, was the cocaine business. Pablo Escobar was loyal to the dollar, so he went wherever the pay was higher. It was around the mid-1970s, and cocaine was only cooked by a few drug dealers in Colombia. One of those drug dealers was Fabio Restrepo, who Pablo met and began working with closely. Okay, before I say anything else, I want you to listen closely, cause what I'm about to say to you next was the exact moment Pablo Escobar's life changed forever. Pablo worked with Restrepo as a courier of coca paste, a vital substance needed for the production of cocaine. Restrepo employed Pablo and one of his cousins to transport this coca paste from the Andean mountains to his cocaine labs in the forests of Medellin. Pablo did his job pretty well and also found a way to get very close to Restrepo. Maybe too close if you ask me. And after a while, Fabio moved Pablo from courier to smuggler. Pablo and different pilots smuggled cocaine from Medellin to countries like Bolivia and Peru. Every trip was extremely dangerous, so the pay was as high as $1 million. But as awesome as that sounds, Restrepo only shipped about 40 to 60 kilos of coke once or twice a year. Like, this guy was losing out on the big market, and Pablo was freaking pissed about it. The Estrepo was playing things safe. Pablo wanted more money, more power, more influence in the cocaine market. And that was the moment he did one of the most cold-hearted things he ever did. He ordered the assassination of Fabio Estrepo. Pablo straight up killed his boss Fabio and took over his cocaine market and business. But somehow, he didn't have a solid plan. Yeah, he knew all about the shipment of cocaine, but he had no idea about that cooking process. And even though the previous cooks were around to help, Pablo was fortunate enough to meet a man who made his cocaine stand out from the rest. And that man was Mateo Moreno, aka the Cockroach. Mateo Moreno was a Chilean drug chemist who fled his country in 1973 when the Chilean military began clamping down on drug traffickers. He got his nickname, the Cockroach, after he managed to escape a brutal shootout at a cocaine exportation center in the Chile desert. And Mateo, being a drug chemist, knew the ins and outs of making the purest coke in the world. So he moved to Colombia, where he knew his skills would be needed, and partnered up with Escobar to start up a cocaine cooking lab. Another group of people that teamed up with Pablo were the Ochoa brothers, who also ran cocaine exports out of Colombia. They were Pablo's biggest competitors, so instead of creating a rivalry, Pablo made them his allies. Then, the group of Pablo Escobar, the Ochoa brothers, Pablo's cousin, Gustavo, and the Cockroach formed the Medellin cartel in 1976. Pablo Escobar was just 26 years old at that time, and he was making millions of dollars. And as a man with that amount of money, women were a constant in his life. But there was one woman he liked more than any other, and that woman was Maria Victoria Henao, the woman he eventually married. Maria was just 15 years old when she met Pablo, but they both seemed pretty in love. So in love that Pablo wanted them to get married. I mean, yeah, Maria was freaking 15, so her parents didn't really like this. However, Maria and Pablo eventually eloped together, and 4 years later, Pablo was living in his residential estate known as Hacienda Nápoles, said to be worth a whopping $63 million. And as much as he had a lot of money, he still had not yet infiltrated the American market. His major buyers came from Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador, until he met a man who gave him the keys to the United States through his brilliant idea. This man was Carlos Leder, and he's the brain behind Pablo Escobar's monopoly of America's cocaine market. He created a transshipment network that allowed cargo planes to transport over 100 kilos of cocaine over the US border without going detected. Then once they got to Miami, the kilos of cocaine were transloaded to speedboats headed for the shores of Miami. But as simple as that plan sounds, it took a lot of skillful planning to make it work. And after successfully taking over the entire cocaine supply in America, Pablo was shipping about 400 kilos of cocaine per trip, going 5 to 6 trips per day. Soon, Pablo and Carlos worked together to develop a new transshipment point in the Bahamas, an island called Norman's Cay, about 350 kilometers southeast of the Florida coast. Escobar then built an airstrip, a harbor, a hotel, houses, boats, aircraft, and a refrigerated warehouse to store the cocaine. So, from 1978 to 1982, this island in the Bahamas was used as a central smuggling route for the Medellin cartel and for Pablo Escobar. But the truth is, Escobar's legacy remains controversial. While many denounce the heinous nature of his crimes, he was seen as a Robin Hood-like figure for many in Colombia. He built churches, schools, hospitals, and shelters, while also killing people who stood in his way. His death was mourned, and his funeral was attended by over 25,000 people. So to answer the question, how did Pablo Escobar become the wealthiest drug lord of all time? Well, the answer revolves around two words: drugs and money.